Welcome back to the show, everyone. I'm really excited to host Whitney Webb once again. Whitney, you are probably my most popular guest. Everyone requests you. You do fantastic investigative work. So thanks so much for joining me again.
Thanks. Yeah, my pleasure to be back.
Let's start out with the election because I feel like that's on the forefront of everyone's minds. I feel like some polls are saying one person's ahead, another says the complete opposite. But one thing I love that you've said on my show before is no one's going to come in and save us. We really have to take personal responsibility. We have to become sovereign over our decisions and our finances. So, can I just get your
hmm
take on the election? We've seen a lot of changes in the last couple of months, and things feel like they're getting crazier and crazier leading up to November.
Yeah, well, I think as far as this particular election goes, things are going to get crazier as we get closer to November. And, I think that's sort of by design to sort of try and get people, Americans really engaged with electoral politics again, because I think most people have been really burnt out and really disillusioned with both parties. And I think you're going to continue to see both parties attempt to energize their bases by very perhaps unconventional means, or doing stuff that maybe they haven't done before. But either way, I think, regardless of who wins, ultimately a lot of the same people are going to get what they want, because at the end of the day, so much of the stuff that the American people are tired of are really bipartisan agendas, right? And, regardless of who's in office, when there's a crisis, the same people tend to be called upon to solve the crisis. So, a good example of that would be the 2008 economic crisis. BlackRock was basically sent in to help handle the banker bailouts. And then during COVID, when Trump was in office, BlackRock was brought in to essentially design the COVID fiscal policy, which the ramifications of which we're still dealing with. That's just one example, but there's so much, whether it's funding wars or funding, the state of Israel, for example, with billions of U.S. tax dollars and things like that. There tends to be bipartisan consensus about a lot of things. But I think, there's an effort to sort of frame this as an election that's not that. And, each group in their particular, partisan silos, think their candidate is going to be the answer and magically reverse all of this stuff. But unfortunately, both are essentially, bankrolled by, major forces in Silicon Valley specifically. And a lot of those Silicon Valley oligarchs tend to double as contractors to both the military, and also intelligence communities. And so, maybe you'll have sort of the PayPal mafia crowd behind Trump this time, maybe because of JD Vance, but he's got, David Sachs and Elon Musk and people like that in his corner. And even though Peter Thiel's being quite quiet, there seems to be some overlap there as well, which we can get into later. And then, of course, on the Kamala side, you have people like Reid Hoffman and Eric Schmidt, who are also share a lot of overlap with the oligarchs on the other side. Like Eric Schmidt and Peter Thiel sit on the steering committee of the Bilderberg Conference, which is kind of notorious for being a closed door meeting of prominent, globalists in the corporate world and in the public sector, and Reid Hoffman and David Sachs and Elon Musk are all part of the so-called PayPal mafia. They just happen to fund different parties, and all of these oligarchs at the end of the day, do they frame the reasoning for why they want these policies differently? They agree about more biometric surveillance, they agree about digital ID, and they ultimately agree about programmable surveillable currency, whether it's a CBDC or a private bank digital currency that's also surveillable and programmable. So, if you're against those things as policies, it's important to pay attention to the policies and not so much the campaign rhetoric, because people tend to forget, during a campaign season, that campaigns are essentially sales pitches, and very few people, when they campaign, actually keep their campaign promises once in office. And one example would be, Trump back in 2016 and 2015, campaigning that he was going to reinstate Glass-Steagall. And then when he was actually in office, allowed banks to be deregulated even further. And of course, there's plenty of examples for that for the Democrats as well. Obama being, a really glaring one with, being against the big banks during the 2008 economic crisis, and then having his entire cabinet essentially being chosen by Citigroup, right? Which arguably caused the crisis and had Glass-Steagall repealed to facilitate its merger in the late 90s. So, I mean, this is kind of stuff that, people forget, and it kind of makes me unpopular for bringing it up. I mean, some people don't like to hear this stuff during election season because people get really emotionally invested in particular candidates. But getting emotionally invested in candidates is not my job. My job is to remind people of the policy records of the candidates that are running and the ramifications of the policies that they're suggesting on the campaign trail. And so in the case of both Trump and I guess Kamala, who's going to just be an extension of the Biden administration, these people have been in office before, and we can compare what they said on the campaign trail to what they actually did before. And I think it's important to do that so people don't get burned this time, at least not as badly, assuming that, things are going to be different this time and getting really emotionally invested in that outcome and then have that not be the outcome. I think generally when politicians do not keep their campaign promises, and, we should pay attention to what they did when they were in office more than what they've said in the past on the campaign trail, at the end of the day. So, maybe that doesn't make me popular in some circles, but I do tend to dunk on both parties. But, invariably what happens in election season is if you dunk on one candidate, they'll just assume you support the other. So I have people thinking, I support both Trump and Kamala when I don't support either at all. And my position for a long time has been that both parties have been essentially run by, organized crime for decades, probably close to 100 years in the case of the Democrats. So, I'm not really interested in playing those games, but, a lot of people have difficulty breaking from, those cultural structures really that, people have been so used to going through every 4 years, pretty much, their entire lives. So.
Coin Stories is proudly brought to you by Bitdeer, a global leader in disruptive technology for Bitcoin mining and AI. As a publicly traded leader, Bitdeer boasts a massive 900 megawatts of operational data center capacity and an additional 1.1 gigawatts under development across 3 continents, positioning Bitdeer as one of the most diversified and power-dense computing companies in the world. Bitdeer's leadership laid the groundwork for the original advancements in Bitcoin mining ASICs. It's really the only company in the industry with the track record and clout to disrupt the market again with groundbreaking new designs for the next generation of mining ASICs. Now, Bitdeer is leveraging years of expertise in data center and cloud management into high-performance computing through a recently announced partnership with NVIDIA. Join Bitdeer in reshaping the world of Bitcoin mining. Learn more at bitdeer.com and explore how they are pioneering the future today. No, I totally get it. I mean, we've become so polarized. I used to never really question what politics does someone represent or how did someone vote and whether that would affect my ability to be friends with them. But today, it seems like it's creating strife even among family members and neighbors and friends, which
Sure.
is so crazy how
And like COVID.
Yeah, we've placed ourselves in teams. But that actually makes me think of a question for you related to Bitcoin, because a lot of people want to vote orange. They really just want to pick the candidate that is going to be most friendly to Bitcoin. And I know you've done a lot of research and work in this area, because when we went to the Bitcoin conference, we did see a lot of conservative figures. Trump came out and said he's going to be for Bitcoin and embrace it. We had RFK Jr. since last year saying he has policies that are going to be pro Bitcoin. And then the Biden and Kamala administration, they've been the most hostile. I think some people are trying to open up communication lines, but they haven't been going that well. Can you offer your take on specifically related to Bitcoin, the people that are passionate about financial freedom and the candidates that we have to select from?
Yeah, well, I think it's pretty obvious that it's the conservative camp really only, aside from, RFK being an independent, that are interested in really appealing to the Bitcoin base at all as it relates to electoral politics, and they've done so very successfully. But I think again, what you're seeing here is sort of what we saw over the course of the past year was sort of Wall Street warming up to Bitcoin. And what we're seeing, it's just another extension of the establishment cozying up to Bitcoin, I guess. So I guess you could frame, Larry Fink's about face and all of that as sort of the private sector establishment turnaround, and this is sort of the public sector establishment turnaround. But as far as it relates to financial freedom, I don't think the policies expressed by, Trump, or at least what Trump expressed or hinted at in his speech, because he didn't, as far as RFKs went, he was more deliberate about what his policies specific. And Trump was a little more vague, but based on what, Trump said, talking about sort of yoking Bitcoin and the dollar together and using that to expand the dollar's power and hegemony globally, and then also bringing in stable coins, which of course would be in this case dollar denominated stable coins into the play. We have to consider what that means if the reason we're voting for it is to ensure that Bitcoin will be used to propagate financial freedom globally. So, if you're of the opinion that you want Bitcoin to be, hyper Bitcoinization to come at all costs, even if that means it not being a tool for financial freedom anymore, or it being used by intelligence agencies to surveil people, or by Wall Street to, do their thing, then maybe it's fine. But if you're of the idea that, I want Bitcoin to be empowered to end irresponsible fiscal policy
Mm-hmm.
at the national level and want it to ensure financial freedom for everybody, then I don't think Trump's policies necessarily spell that out, unfortunately. And part of that has to do with the whole stablecoin play. So Trump has been very openly against central bank digital currencies. But the problem with stable coins, particularly the big ones, is that they're just as programmable and surveillable as CBDCs could be. So most people are against CBDCs because of the programmability aspect and and the surveillability aspect, being able to trace and surveil every dollar you spend. And, stable coins can offer that as well, because most of them are, built, they're like ERC20 tokens right at the end of the day, and have that programmability functionality. And some, stablecoin issuers that are prominent, like Circle, openly talk about the programmability aspects of their stablecoin. And, they're in a very deep alliance with BlackRock, Circle particularly, and Tether itself has made an alliance with the FBI and the Secret Service and, other aspects of the U.S. government to freeze wallets at the behest of the U.S. government, thereby making Tether sort of a soft extension of U.S. foreign and fiscal policy abroad as it relates to sanctions and other things. Some of which the U.S., of course, in the past has used to facilitate regime change operations and other things, not necessarily stop terrorism, as they are inclined to say. So it's important to keep that in mind. And, if you're allowing intelligence agencies, what the FBI technically is, to be onboarded onto your stablecoin, it's really not a private sector thing. It's a public-private partnership. And public-private partnership is the model that the U.S. and really most of the world essentially favors. And so, I think these stable coins offer that same kind of threat to financial freedom, or, easily could, were things to develop that way. And so, if programmability and surveillability is the threat to financial freedom, then we should not support that, right? And instead look for ways to build robust privacy tools on the base layer of Bitcoin, maybe, and try and make it something that's transactable, as opposed to this idea of having it be a storage or a technology for asset storage, as Larry Fink says, and something no one spends and people just hold, which is, what Larry Fink wants, and also, the way Bitcoin would be utilized in the framework that was laid out in the Trump speech at the conference.
I want
So, mhm.
I want to dig into stablecoins and dollar hegemony a little bit more, because I heard you and Mark Goodwin, your co-author of one of the investigations on the What Bitcoin Did podcast. And I'm not sure if it was you or Mark, but talking about the idea of the dollar hyperinflating into Bitcoin almost. And I was wondering if you could kind of break down the mechanics, because I know a lot of my viewers or listeners will be familiar with the fact that the dollar is in trouble, maybe not in the near term, because these things take a while to play out, but countries are de-dollarizing. There is less of an incentive to hold US treasuries because we just keep printing. Now stable coins are providing new demand for these treasuries, which would
Yeah,
potentially
record
extend,
demand, really.
yeah, which could
Hmm.
extend dollar dominance. But like, how, what is this plan that you sort of see in place, this strategy, so that the dollar remains the global reserve currency, but there is that Bitcoin component to it?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you consider what the fiscal policy has been with respect to the dollar, since the creation of the Federal Reserve, the purchasing power of the dollar has just, been demolished over the course of the past 100+ years. So in order to sort of get away from that, viewing Bitcoin as really the only means of digital credit. If you're going to make, digital dollars, if you're able to yoke digital dollars to that and use it as a sink for hyperinflation, that seems to be sort of the idea here. And obviously, the person that can speak best to this is Mark, who wrote the book on the Bitcoin dollar, as he calls it. And I would really recommend anyone more interested in that to either look up his interviews or read his book, because he's obviously a lot more qualified to talk about that than I am. But I think ultimately, at the end of the day, if that system is to come to fruition, it has major implications for why a lot of people got into Bitcoin in the first place, which is to stop irresponsible central bank policy and irresponsible U.S. government fiscal policy and, the debt burden and all of that, because it doesn't provide any incentive for them to stop hyperinflating, essentially, or printing debt, creating more debt and all of that. They just view, the view seems to be that they could just use it as a sink for the debt. So, I don't necessarily think that's the big win that maybe some people are framing it as. And I also don't see, necessarily perpetuating the hegemony of the dollar or fiat in general as necessarily a good thing, because, it's just sort of a symptom of the debt-based monetary policy that the world has had for a few hundred years now. And obviously, there have been a lot of problems that have come with that. And I think, as people in the Bitcoin space have pointed out for a long time, that really can't continue. And so do we really want to use Bitcoin to perpetuate that? I think that's an important question. To ask. And I mean, obviously, something has to be done about the U.S. national debt, but is this really the best way to do it? And I don't know. I personally think that some of the people responsible for all of the debt in government, Congress, who are, most of those people are multimillionaires working on behalf of multi-billionaires. Maybe they should be held accountable for some of the national debt stuff and not just be like, oh, we can use Bitcoin as our plaything to sort of get out of all the irresponsible decisions we've made for the past, 100 years plus.
But I know that you do see potential for Bitcoin, and it is an opportunity if we go in the right direction, right? If individuals take it seriously to self custody and all of that. So, how do you see, maybe in a positive way, Bitcoin holding the government more accountable or helping us move to a standard that is a little bit more fair and based on something that no one can manipulate or control? Or do you really worry that, the forces in power are going to make it such that privacy is pretty much impossible and everyone needs to custody with these centralized custodians so that they can kind of surveil and track your Bitcoin? Like, do you think that these forces are just going to clash and one's more powerful than other? Because we have the numbers, right? We're the people, but
Yeah, well, I think the system they're setting up, I mean, the goal is to have the US dollar, Bitcoin, and stablecoins all be part of the same ecosystem. And you see, prominent Bitcoin banks, as it were, like Zappo, marketing that they're the bridge between those three things, because the goal is to have those three things all be part of the same system, as it was essentially outlined by Trump's speech. As it relates to Bitcoin, I think that is not the answer. I think, if Bitcoin is the sound money, it should be what is transactable between people,
Mhm.
and that robust privacy tools need to be built upon it. Because if the issue is surveillability, I think that needs to be tackled there. And I think, based on how this whole system's been described, the retail facing part of it would be the stable coins, and that people would just be holding but never transacting with their Bitcoin. But there has to be consensus for that, and it seems like the establishment consensus, and there's a lot of people in the Bitcoin space that are just very caught up in the electoral politics and the emotions of it, and feeling validated for what the industry they've been in for several years, that's obviously sort of not been favored by the establishment. Some people are maybe thinking, oh, since the establishment is favoring this, let's cheer it on. But is it really the best system for everybody? And is it the best for financial freedom? And all of that. So I would urge people to consider, what is it that you want Bitcoin to be used for? Not just, well, again, there's some people that are hyper Bitcoinization at all costs. Doesn't matter if we totally abandon the original ethos behind Bitcoin and getting there. And I think there definitely are a significant amount of those people, but I don't agree with that. I think the ethos is very important. I think Bitcoin is unique, and it's really the only opportunity like this we're likely to have, at least in this important window of time. And, people need to decide if they're going to use it to
Yeah.
fight for those things, or if they're going to acquiesce to this system that's being set up and is going to be pushed on people, most likely through regulation and executive orders. And it's very likely that in the next 2 years, whoever wins in November is going to be president during an unprecedented US government debt crisis. And this is, if you already see it in Trump's policy, if he's in office, this is the system he's going to propose as the solution. And when there is a crisis and the solution is proposed, a lot of people, because it's a crisis and are demanding a rapid resolution to that crisis, they don't think about what's best in the long term necessarily. They're just looking for something to solve the immediate crisis. And so I think this is sort of hinting at what we're going to see. But again, I would urge people to go back to what Trump did when he was in office during the COVID crisis and the fiscal policy that his Treasury Department presided over, which was very bad and very criminal. And for people that aren't familiar, I would encourage them to look up the work of John Titus about the going direct reset, where essentially before there was a financial crisis related to COVID in late 2019, BlackRock created this plan that pitched to the central bankers at the Jackson Hole meeting in 2019 about going direct. And basically the idea was, during the next crisis, let's QE again, but instead of giving the QE money to public entities, let's give it straight to the private banks. And that's essentially what happened. And one of the people that received those funds, those emergency funds that were meant for Main Street, was BlackRock, and they used it to buy shares in their own ETFs instead of bailing out the people whose whose businesses were forced to close as part of government policy. And so really, this is one of the key reasons why you saw an unprecedented wealth transfer happen during COVID. And this plan wasn't implemented as soon as COVID started. They actually started when the repo market started to go haywire at the end of 2019 and used COVID as the excuse to ramp it up. So, Larry Fink's involvement in that, and also his involvement in the 2008 financial crisis, for example, these same people at Wall Street, when there's a crisis, affect these massive wealth transfers that take, money from regular Americans to the very top, who are now richer than ever, especially after COVID. And, regardless of who wins in November, when this debt crisis comes home to roost, that's what's going to happen. And I think they're going to use that as well to saddle the American people with surveillable, programmable money. Maybe it's more likely if Kamala gets in, it'll be a CBDC. But it seems quite clear that if Trump gets in, it will be a private bank digital currency, or some of these private bank issued stablecoins or tokenized deposits and things like that, which again are just as surveillable and programmable as stablecoins. And maybe it will be framed as a win, but a win for what, really? Again, I'm not super optimistic about that. But again, I mean, my view is that the government is essentially run by, organized crime and intelligence agencies that have fused what they do, and it's been very profitable for them. And they're going to continue to do that and pull the strings of both parties. And when there's a crisis, this is invariably what happens. And there's plenty of historical precedents to look at as far as, the economics of it are concerned.
Yeah, well, the wealth concentration you highlighted, I feel like that's one of the things that ultimately, thankfully, led me to Bitcoin, because I was getting so frustrated and disillusioned, and I didn't know who to blame. And it was when I started to peer into how the financial system actually worked that I was like, oh, this is the root problem. It's politics and the polarization are all symptoms that are coming from it, but at the root of it, really just manipulated money, broken incentives, and corruption at the core. So I felt a lot of hope in Bitcoin, and I want to tug on something that you said, because one thing that I'm trying to do actually as well, and I see some of the other public figures in Bitcoin doing this, is when you go full force combating, maybe the people in power or powerful corporations, you don't get very far, right? And so I think of a quote from the 80s, Frederick Hayek, the economist who didn't, Bitcoin wasn't around, but he said something about like, the only way that we're going to fix the problem of government and money is if we introduce something in a sly and roundabout way that they pretty much cannot stop. And I think a lot of people have hope that that is what Bitcoin is, that it's a Trojan horse that as long as the more that we almost present it in a way that's very friendly and it can assimilate perfectly into the financial system, don't worry about it. Yes, oh yes, the dollar will remain global reserve currency, but ultimately, because of its decentralization and global adoption, it will sort of take over and be this neutral, not only reserve asset and all that, but currency that we can exchange value. Why do we need 160 currencies? Do you see that as being possible at all? That like it could Trojan horse in the solution so that we don't have to deal with all this. I mean, there will always be corruption, but that it won't be so easy because when you can manipulate the money, it makes it a lot easier and more lucrative to do the horrible things that we see people doing.
Well, I think it depends on what happens with regulation and moving forward ultimately. I think it's been made very clear by the people that like it in the traditional financial system now,
Mhm.
that they only like it if it's, used as digital gold and not as something transactable. They don't want to transact with it. They want it to be something that's held and again is for asset storage, really. And that it's a digital asset, that it's never a digital currency. And I think we would be naive to underestimate them. Maybe they're acting like they're on, the team of regular Bitcoiners right now, but I definitely don't think that's true. I think there's going to be a lot of efforts to centralize it as much as it can be and control the on and off ramps as much as possible. And, potentially make efforts to criminalize efforts to put privacy on Bitcoin. And I don't know. I mean, it honestly depends with a lot of the decisions that are made going forward. But I would definitely uh, want people to be more vigilant as opposed to being like, oh, as long as these people like Bitcoin, we have won and Bitcoin will fix this and we can sit back and relax and just wait for things to happen.
Right.
I think that's kind of QAnon-esque, and I don't think that's
Yeah.
I think that's exactly what people like Larry Fink would like us to do, ultimately. And so if you want it to be those things and want it to be a currency and be transactable, and be able to challenge some of these efforts to
Yeah.
centralize it and surveil it, then efforts need to be, you need to be very proactive about making that a reality.
Yeah.
Um,
No, that's a good.
and pushing back against it. And I think an important time to do that is now, before there are regulations, before the system is in place, the system that the establishment would like to put in place, and the place it wants Bitcoin to hold,
Yeah.
in their system. Obviously, that's going to be a system that benefits them a lot more than it benefits the rest of us. It's important to keep in mind that people like Larry Fink have very overtly said that markets don't like democracies. They like totalitarian governments. So this is a guy that is not about promoting your financial freedom or anyone's financial freedom. This is someone that likes top-down, centralized control to reduce risk in markets in which he trades and is active, so he can, make more profit for his shareholders, which are, multi-billionaires and other people like that. So, and of course, Fink's in that category as well. So, to trust these people, I think would be very naive. And I think, maybe there is hope of some sort of Trojan horse functionality there at some point later on, but not if people
Mhm.
aren't thinking about that the whole time and thinking about how they'll affect those changes later on. And again, I think it would be very naive to think that regulation, or the FBI or any of these other agencies aren't going to be very intense when it comes to how people are using Bitcoin, and if they're using it the wrong way. You have a lot of these establishment actors partnering up with groups like Chain Analysis, which I believe was funded by NQTel, the CIA. They have a very vested interest in that. And then you have former CIA directors like Mitchell Morrill, who now works for Beacon Global Strategies, putting out pieces on Bitcoin and things like that, saying that, it would be preferable if criminals used Bitcoin instead of $100 cash bills and
Yeah.
stuff. So, they definitely think they're going to be successfully able to surveil people. And again, they will be if regular Bitcoiners or developers do nothing to prevent that. And I think there's an effort sort of to make people think, oh, look, here we are, we've arrived, we've won, and sort of
Yeah.
get people to sit back and relax and do nothing, which again, I think was a lot of the strategy behind the whole like QAnon trust the plan thing, while Trump didn't keep his campaign promises. Oh, he's not keeping it because there's 5D chess happening, and just sit back in your chair and don't be active and don't hold him to account and don't demand that he keep the campaign promises that matter to you and things like
Mhm.
that. Again, I would urge people to be vigilant and
Yeah.
proactive, I guess.
It's time for a quick break to hear these messages from my partners who make this podcast possible. Next up, Speed Bitcoin Lightning Wallet, one of the fastest growing wallets out there. Speed is a secure, low cost way to send or receive Bitcoin instantly. It's super simple and scores high user ratings. You can even use it to shop gift cards of your favorite brands and earn rewards. Download Speed using the QR code on the screen or the link in my show notes and use promo code CoinStories10 to get 5,000 free sats. Next up, CoinKite. CoinKite makes everything you need to safely self-custody your Bitcoin, including the cold card wallet. That's the cold storage device I use for safekeeping my Bitcoin. You can verify the source code, it's ultra secure, and it's easy to use even if you're a beginner. Head to their site in my show notes and get a 5% discount with promo code CoinStories. And finally, the why of Bitcoin is easy to grasp, but the how can be so confusing. The Bitcoin Way is a professional Bitcoin IT and security team offering personalized one-on-one support that guides you through cold storage, setting up nodes, inheritance planning, privacy best practices, and more. Don't take my word for it. Take 82-year-old customer Bill's.
Give the Bitcoin Way a try. You will be well on your way to owning and protecting the greatest money ever discovered.
Set up your 30-minute free consultation today. All right, back to the show. No, I think you bring up such good points about how we shouldn't be complacent and just assume that Bitcoin is inevitable, because if we all just hold it with massive multi-billion-dollar corporations, then that just goes against the whole ethos and the principles of Bitcoin. And I think the next decade will be a battle for privacy and the right to self-custody, because I think that's where a lot of the issues reside. And you point out in your reporting that we have to also remember that even though this is a decentralized public ledger, that Bitcoin does rely heavily on energy companies and internet infrastructure, which are highly centralized, right? And
Yes,
so
they are.
what do you want
Mhm.
people to know about that?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people don't think about the infrastructure play of it, but it's held in very few hands, and there's a very small group of people that run, most of the dominant services we use and the infrastructure we use. I mean, most of the internet itself, I think, is, the essential infrastructure of it is like 13 servers around the world. And it's actually a lot more fragile than people think, and also a lot more centralized than people think. And there's a lot of ways where they could implement unprecedented censorship of people, whether that's, financially or speech wise, if they wanted to. And so there are a lot of agendas as it relates to being able to use the infrastructure at all going forward. I think we've talked about before sort of the effort to force people to adopt some sort of biometric digital ID in order to access the internet at all by going through the internet service provider. Again, there's only a handful of those. That industry is also pretty centralized. And so, if
Yeah.
your ability to, access Bitcoin or run a node or anything is dependent on, power, and you're
Yeah.
not off grid or whatever, or it's dependent on an ISP and things like that. Yeah, that's definitely something people should consider. And I think, from Mark's and my reporting, it's really clear that the powers that be that are interested in, financially surveilling us to the greatest extent possible, and basically surveilling us, period, to the greatest extent possible, have been thinking about these things for a very long time. And as it relates to Bitcoin, I mean, they've been thinking about it for well over 10 years. And they've put a lot of money into how they're going to make it work for them. And so we need to, again, direct resources to how we're going to make it work for the people, if we're going to make it work for the people.
Yeah. When you mentioned the debt crisis and you kind of see that a couple years out, can you talk a little bit more about that? Because we've spoken in the past about this controlled demolition of the financial system that you see happening, and obviously they need something for us to move to. And a lot of people, I think, at this point think, oh, CBDCs, that's not going to be a concern, at least not here in the United States, because we're going to push back, and we also have Bitcoin. But you bring up the the stablecoin path that policymakers might want to take. So how will this debt crisis actually play out? Because one thing I've been amazed by, especially when I look at the current economic situation globally, is we can just kick the can down the road, and as soon as there's a mini panic or it feels like we're about to hit a bust, something comes in to rush in and provide liquidity or save it, and all of a sudden we're fine. We recover, new all-time highs in the stock market. I mean, how is this going to play out that we go over the cliff, we hit a crisis?
Yeah, so in the case of any sort of controlled demolition, I don't think they want it to happen until they're ready for it to happen. And so, they're going to wait for certain metrics to be met before it kicks off.
Yeah.
So obviously, like I mentioned earlier, with all this stuff around COVID-19, it seems like the economy was in major trouble before COVID. And if COVID hadn't happened when it did, we could have had an economic crisis then without the excuse to, basically print trillions of dollars as, this is our response to the lockdown and the pandemic. I mean, like I said, it was happening before, and they found a way to make it keep rattling on for a little longer. But they know they can't do that forever, right? Because it's a mathematical inevitability that eventually the debt catches up with us if something different isn't done. And again, a lot of the solutions I think they're going to propose are going to be things that people would not normally accept were it not a time of crisis. And so when you have a crisis and people are really stressed out
and scared,
especially if it has to do with their money or losing their money or losing their purchasing power, I think you'll see people sign on to things that they normally would not sign on to. So again, I think it's very likely that we're going to see dollar stable coins proliferate. And I think part of this too is that, the Fed has essentially said for a few years now that it makes the most sense to do stable coins. You have former top people in the CIA saying that stable coins make a lot more sense than a CBDC. And they say that because, digital dollar stable coins are already here, and they're already servicing the debt through their, mass purchases of treasuries, right? And so if they were to do a CBDC project or something like that, it would take them several years to develop, and they'd be behind a lot of other countries in the world. Whereas if they make this switch to dollar stable coins and make that the preferred currency of American consumers, then, they sort of avoid those problems that way and still are able to obtain the surveillability and programmability through these public-private partnerships with the private stablecoin issuers that they would have even if it was a CBDC, right? So I think, to make that switch, they can just be like, well, maybe your dollar in this, maybe these banks failed and you think your money may be gone, but we'll give you the same amount of money that you had in your bank, but in the form of these stable coins or something, and you can redeem them here. I mean, pretty much most Americans, I think, would do that to not, lose all their money instantly, right? And so I think it's likely that we're going to see some sort of situation like that. I mean, remember back to the regional banking crisis with Silicon Valley Bank. It seems very likely that a lot more of that is going to happen.
Yeah.
And I think you could actually look at that crisis, which arguably was manufactured and made to happen. And that 2008 was kind of similar in that way. And those are major bank consolidation plays. And I think there's going to be an effort to consolidate the banking industry even further in the US with the next crisis. And then those banks are going to be like, well, here you go, tokenized deposits, redeem them this way, or stable coins, or, JP Morgan's JPM coin or something like that, transact with that. Wells Fargo's working on one. A lot of these, the biggest banks in the US have done that, and then they'll be able to keep the two-tier banking system in the US the way it is now, but frame it as something, maybe different than it is. We're just modernizing this, and this is going to prevent these crises from happening again, and maybe we'll roll in Bitcoin so that the dollar stays strong and you don't have to worry about hyperinflation. And, I think people in considering what kind of crisis it is, may really see that as the right solution. But this is something that, again, they've been, developing for quite a long time. And I think if people were to critically think about what a lot of this means, they would not support it, because ultimately, a lot of the uproar about CBDCs, again, was about programmability and surveillability. And I mean, getting every American onboarded onto something that would essentially offer that. And eliminate cash overnight, maybe, is something that people would, again, acquiesce to during a crisis, but not during a non-crisis
Yeah.
time,
This kind of echoes the talk that I had with Ed Dowd, because he forecasts something really similar. And it's crazy to see how much stable coins have grown, especially some of the really big ones like Circle and Tether. And yet they are very opaque. I mean, they won't release, they're not very transparent about their reserves. But then you have maybe really big legacy money managers coming out saying, "Oh no, I've seen everything," and they totally have all the dollars that back up the stable coins. But I mean, literally anyone can launch this, right? And say, "Okay, I've created now 500,000 stable coins and I have the $500,000 to back them up, and it's one for one." But how do you really know? Because all of this is, again, centralized, right? And like,
Yeah.
there's such a demand for the dollar around the world, so it probably will, I mean, there will be a lot of incentive for the US government, being sort of the superpower, to try to take all of these under its purview or under its wings, so that they see everything that's happening, because they don't like offshore dollars, right?
Yeah, so you sort of touched on something that I want to point out for a second, because I think it's really important. So as this relates to demand for dollars abroad, I think is very important. So what you're seeing in economies outside of the US that have major inflation issues,
Yeah.
Argentina, a good example, are people flocking into dollar stable coins.
Mm-hmm.
In Argentina, obviously it makes sense to do that for regular Argentines that don't want to lose their purchasing power. But if you look at why Argentina is in the situation it is in now, they've been the subject of economic warfare since like the late 70s. And a lot of that was done by US intelligence working with the biggest Wall Street banks to do that, who became sort of the debt barons and quote unquote vulture capitalists targeting Argentina, and sort of resulting in a lot of this. Well, first their economic collapse in 2001, and then everything downstream of that. And a lot of people involved in that in various administrations were Argentines that had worked for these Wall Street banks like JP Morgan, for example. And so, historically, what a lot of unscrupulous players in the US power establishment have tried to do, as the Latin American debt crisis has, waxed and waned since the 1980s, is dollarize various economies. So, of course, this happened in El Salvador. It happened in Ecuador. They stop having their own currency. They essentially lose their financial sovereignty and are at the whims of the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
So if you get everyone onto dollar stable coins, you're essentially, if you can do sort of like what Milei proposed, dollarizing Argentina. Well, maybe he doesn't necessarily have to do formal dollarization like in the past anymore. He can just onboard everyone onto dollar stable coins. But the way it services US debt and expands dollar hegemony, and also, expands the soft political power of the US, because the US, it's important to keep in mind, I think around 2008 or 2009, WikiLeaks published a leaked military manual where they described the IMF, the World Bank, and various other institutions as financial weapons of the US military. And so there's this whole idea of using, basically these institutions which saddle countries with debt. So basically using debt as a weapon, and all these different financial weapons to keep governments around the world in line.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you onboard them all into Tether, for example, which is very prominent in Argentina, but Tether is partnered with the FBI and the Secret Service, and has, Paulo Arduino has openly said that, Tether is going to be a world-class partner to expand US dollar hegemony globally, and freeze the wallets of whoever, OFAC and the Treasury says their wallet needs to be freezed for reasons X, Y, and Z, regardless of what it is. They will do so, and then they'll lose their financial sovereignty as a nation, but by other means, right? So I think what we're seeing is a way to sort of covertly make a new model for dollarization. And, I think people like Larry Summers, I think he was on the podcast of Jeremy Allaire, who runs Circle, was essentially saying that this is what stable coins are doing. And of course, Larry Summers was Secretary of the Treasury at the end of the 90s. When countries like Ecuador were dollarized. So he intimately knows how that works. And he also used to have a leading role at the World Bank, and a leading role in creating the 2008 financial crisis and dealing with the debt explosion and, I guess, pillaging of Mexico after the 1995, peso collapse there and all of that. And so, this is someone that has a lot of experience in how those things work. And he's, essentially saying stable coins, dollar stablecoins are proving to be this. So, you know, it's a way of sort of making, you know, the financial tools of empire, sort of modernizing those and sort of imposing those on other countries. And a lot of people frame, you know, stablecoins as human rights tools. And look how great this is, that people in Argentina are getting so into dollar stablecoins. But I think there's a lot of risk there. And I think, again, to repeat, a lot of these economies and countries in Latin America have been expressly targeted by Wall Street that are trying to exploit and take their resources. This is, you know, very common in South America and Africa historically, which are very resource-rich continents.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of efforts to sort of take control of those resources, and, you know, through the imperial model and whatnot. And I think this is sort of a way to update that, not really a way to liberate these people. So, you know, I think that's an important point to bring up when it comes to the stablecoin play, because yes, it will, if implemented in the US as the, you know, the retail facing medium of exchange for, you know, most American consumers. Yes, there's programmability and surveillability there, but there is a definite plan to have this go global and have all the countries, you know, dollarize a lot of countries, focusing mainly on the global South, whose economies have been messed with periodically by institutions like the IMF and the World Bank that the US government openly says are financial weapons, because, you know, after those institutions were created, the US has the dominant influence at both of those institutions.
No, all of that stuff makes me so angry. If the people listening and watching haven't read Check Your Financial Privilege by Alex Gladstein, I really recommend it, because it's horrible what the World Bank and the IMF have done. I mean, basically, there are so many developing countries that will never probably develop because they've got this burden of debt on them, and we essentially extract the resources and the wealth, and we get richer at the expense of people all over the world that are suffering in some cases. I mean, physically suffering to build things that enrich Western nations, and it's horrifying. I'm really glad that you shine a spotlight on it. I wanted to ask you something, and now I'm forgetting my train of thought, but okay, you brought up Larry Summers, who's in your book and a lot of your investigative pieces linked to like Clinton and Epstein and all of that. There are a lot of these characters that keep resurfacing. And in your recent, the PayPal Paxos piece, I think Peter Thiel also came up, and in your JD Vance investigation. Peter Thiel is someone who really confused me, because at the beginning, I think a lot of Bitcoiners were excited about him. He talked about how great Bitcoin is.
Yeah, and then he's intentionally confusing, I think.
Yeah, he went to the Bitcoin conference and talked about how amazing Bitcoin is while he was selling the top. And then now he says that Bitcoin has no future. And I heard him in this speech basically just, you know, really being offensive to the Bitcoin community. What is his deal? Because I know he's also involved with Palantir, which you've written about, right? What do we know about Peter Thiel?
Oh, there's so much to say about Peter Thiel. Wow. So, yeah. So what you referenced earlier, that like a speech at the Bitcoin conference a few years ago, not only was he selling at the top, but also like right after that, he went on a panel with like then CIA director Mike Pompeo and was like, Bitcoin's probably a financial weapon from China to threaten the dollar. I mean, Peter Thiel is one of those guys that just, I think his public facing remarks are intentionally confusing. That way people can sort of point to, you know, specific quotes and say, oh, he's this, oh, he's that. He's sort of like a public chameleon, I feel like, in that sense. And a lot of people seem to think that Peter Thiel is a libertarian because he has described himself as that. But I mean, if you actually listen to a lot of the stuff he said and also look at the things he's done, he doesn't seem like a libertarian at all. Well, you know, I would make the distinction that if he is a libertarian, he's a cartel market libertarian as opposed to a free market libertarian. Peter Thiel does not like free markets. He does not like free market competition. He says competition is bad for profits and that you should corner a market and create a monopoly. And when he's done that and made monopolies, he's done it in conjunction with three-letter agencies in the US government. So this is not something that someone, you know, a libertarian, quote unquote, does. I mean, he says, why shouldn't libertarians work with the government and enlarge the government and all of this? I mean, it honestly just makes very little sense, frankly. So I think, again, it's, you know, using a word, using an identity, using a label to get people to identify with him, being like, oh, yeah, he's our guy. He's the libertarian billionaire. in Silicon Valley and all of this. Yeah, but if you look at how he built PayPal, the co-founders, which include Peter Thiel and Max Levchin and others, have been pretty open that as they were creating their business, they did so in consultation with pretty much every intelligence agency that would talk to them. And then PayPal, of course, has been partnered with intelligence on and off. And in ways, in ways that are pretty significant as it relates to financial surveillance. And PayPal has also, well, of course, Peter Thiel hasn't been involved with it since the early 2000s or so. But then he went on to create Palantir, which he did so explicitly with the involvement of the CIA. For the first several years of its existence, Palantir's only client was the CIA. So the CIA was their first main funder alongside Thiel himself. And it was really the deliberate resurrection by Thiel and Alex Karp of a failed DARPA public-private surveillance program called Total Information Awareness. And they went to the people that were running Total Information Awareness after it was shut down by Congress and basically tried to pick their brains about how to make a private-only version of this public-private partnership that was criticized by everyone, even in mainstream media, and pretty much every advocacy organization in the United States said this will eliminate privacy for every American, and it's blatantly unconstitutional. And so they just recreated it as a private sector entity. And now Palantir doesn't just do that for the U.S. government; they do it for Wall Street as well. And there's been quotes to the effect that Palantir doesn't just run the intelligence community, they also run Wall Street because, their AI and predictive analytics and all of that are used by some of the biggest firms in Wall Street. And they're also used by every single intelligence agency in the United States. So if you're a libertarian that wants to make government smaller and reduce the excesses and abuses of a government that's gotten out of control, why would you give the most out of control part of the government, the CIA, the most powerful and damaging to freedom weapon in its entire arsenal that's been used to profile Americans for the past 20 years based off of, all of the data we've freely put online, including on social networks like Facebook, which Peter Thiel it wouldn't exist without Peter Thiel. Yes, it's Mark Zuckerberg made it and whatever, but the person that made it what it is was Peter Thiel, because he was the first big outside investor.
Oh, wow.
And the jump from being this little goofy thing on a couple college campuses to being a global social network. And he only left the board relatively recently, a few years ago. So,
oh my gosh.
And another Thiel funded company, Clearview AI, scraped all of the pictures for its facial recognition database off of Facebook, which again, Facebook was also a resurrection of a DARPA program related to total information awareness called LifeLog, by the way. And so basically, Peter Thiel was privatizing all of these very controversial surveillance programs for the intelligence community. And then again, Clearview AI took all of our faces off of Facebook that we freely shared.
Oh my God.
And used it to create a facial recognition database that law enforcement has. And in their sales pitch, they brag about identifying people that were at the Capitol on January 6, 2021, Trump supporters, and passing it all to law enforcement. And now the person probably closest to Peter Thiel in the world, besides people like Sam Altman, is J.D. Vance, Trump's vice presidential candidate.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you about, because essentially Peter Thiel contributed to essentially making his political career, right?
Well, and also his venture capital career, which started at Mithril Capital, and then Peter Thiel was one of the main people that financed his J.D. Vance's own venture capital firm, Narya Capital, and then yes, bankrolled his initial Senate run, and
Wow.
yeah, he's essentially a Thiel-made man.
All the stuff that you said about data and just, I mean, we basically did freely put it out there and now they're using it against us. And you talked in your last piece about how data is pretty much the most liquid commodity and they can weaponize it. And it's so crazy because now all that information's already out there. How do you even remove yourself? And you're right. It's like, no matter who you vote in, you could get really passionate about politics. And I loved what Edward Snowden said at the conference. It's like, vote, but don't join a cult. But like, literally, how do you fix all of this? I don't.
Well, something like Palantir is a really good example of how bipartisan that is. Every administration that's in office, whether it's Democrat or Republican, gives them more and more and more and more and more contracts. you know, and a
Yeah.
lot of these other companies that are sort of in the universe of Palantir, like Anduril and Clearview AI, the same is true there as well. So, again, these are policies that are going to expand regardless of who's in power. Maybe you could debate about maybe it will advance slower with one party than the other, but ultimately, it's the same agenda.
Yeah.
And a lot of that goes back to the fact that they're bankrolled both parties by, differing factions, I guess, of Silicon Valley oligarchs, but those guys agree about widespread financial surveillance and, programmable money and biometric digital ID, which are sort of the foundation for a lot of the stuff in the sustainable development goals, which is really, was written by bankers and isn't really about sustainable development. It's about something else. And sort of this effort for like really a technocratic global government. All of that rests on having digital ID and a surveillance, a
Yeah.
digital wallet tied to it. And a lot of people in the teal verse, I guess, like Sam Altman, his WorldCoin is meant to be that. It's meant to be, both a wallet and a, provider of biometric digital ID. And the United Nations, for example, has been beta testing that exact system for years on the most vulnerable people in the world, on refugees, through things like the Building Blocks program of the World Food Program, where refugees have to scan their eyeball and make a digital ID and have a digital wallet, and they can go in and get their rations, but only if they scan their eyeball. They have to pay with their face, otherwise they don't eat. They've been testing this on the most vulnerable people on the world, but it's a system that's intended for everybody
Yeah.
ultimately. So I think if we want to stop this, it's not about, maybe you can vote for the party you think will implement it more slowly, right? But that's not going to defeat the policy. What will
Right.
defeat the policy is people opting out.
Yeah.
So if you think about, what happened with COVID, like vaccine passports, sort of as a trial run for digital ID, how did you avoid working with vaccine passports? Well, you had to opt out. It was kind of inconvenient. You weren't allowed to go places or do things that other people with them could do. And the same is going to be true with digital ID. So we had that test run with COVID. If you want to oppose digital ID and not participate in that system and opt out, which if you care about really human freedom, you should, then you should think about what you will do to opt out and not
Yeah.
interact with those systems. And if you don't want to use programmable, surveillable money, whether it's from the private sector or the public sector, you should think about what you will do to avoid interacting with such money and having your income surveilled. And exactly how much you think is safe for you to interact with that system. But I would argue the safest is to not interact with it at all. But obviously everyone's different. And there were some people during COVID that had to, do vaccine mandates, or they would lose their jobs, their kids couldn't eat, whatever.
Mhm.
I get that. But we've had, a few years since then, and this is going to happen again. They're going to try and do this again. It may not be under the guise of a pandemic. It might be something else, but or cyber crime, whatever. But they're going to try and impose this some way. And we need to think about how to resist the policy. We should focus on the policies we don't like and think about collectively, how are we going to stop those
Yeah.
policies, or opt out of those policies to the greatest extent we can, instead of, voting for whichever team supports those policies, but maybe less so than the other guy. I think that's
Yeah.
a losing strategy.
Yeah. I mean, so much of what you say is just common sense, and we have to fight for these freedoms. Otherwise, they're going to be very quickly taken away from us, and we're never going to get them back. And it's almost crazy to see how many people are willing to vote out of fear or out of convenience. That's what scares me. I heard the term recently, like, what is it, NPC, non-player character, or something, to describe people that just
Right.
kind of go with whatever they're told, as opposed to making up their own mind. And that really scares me, because you've done so much work exposing the fusion between like big tech, these big corporations who have become monopolies because of the broken financial system, and then the intelligence state and state actors who really don't have the public's interest at heart. And it's like we really have to stand up for personal responsibility and accountability and take our future in our own hands, because otherwise we're just going to be led like sheep in one direction or another. And it's funny, because when I was
Yeah.
when I was a reporter, we would highlight in the most positive way when there was a public-private partnership. Usually it was like some grand announcement, ribbon cutting. This is so exciting, taxpayers and the private corporation getting together. And now through your work, I see that you really have to peel back the layers, because usually there's a hidden agenda that's going to enrich some people and everyone else is going to be hurt maybe and harmed in some way, financially or
Yeah,
otherwise.
it happens a lot. So like there was this Enron subsidiary, well, I think it was Enron in California, that got control of like supplying water to a significant segment of California, but I forget exactly where. And basically, they were also in charge of disposing of the sewage. And so they claimed that they were treating the sewage by pumping it into the aquifer the water was coming from and letting it sit for 6 months. And then that the aquifer would purify it and then they'd give it to people to drink.
Oh my God.
That's the kind of stuff that happens in this crony capitalist, like
Yeah.
free for all madness that the US has had for a very long time. And Enron got a lot of those contracts because of their political connections to the Bush family and things like that. So you have that type of relationship in corporate America where they've, directly colluded or benefited from the state, and this whole like revolving door phenomenon in the US for a long time. And our political parties are funded by these crony capitalists as well that have enriched themselves. I think it's important to point out that like really for a long time, the US really hasn't been a true free market.
No.
It's really been crony capitalist. It's really run by, groups of competing cartels that agree on a lot more then they disagree. And so a lot of times when these crony capitalists, get into these contracts with the public sector and their public-private partnerships,
Yeah.
it doesn't benefit the public. I mean, the Enron thing is like an extreme example, right? But there's a lot of other examples of that kind of stuff happening,
Yeah.
throughout US history and throughout the United States, to the extreme detriment of American public. And invariably when the public sector comes to try and supposedly regulate or rein it in, they just sort of mop it up and cover it up for the benefit of the people with, the big contracts.
Yeah. Well,
so they don't get in trouble and stuff like that. So, I think people should be very tired of that, and we should be very interested in trying to foster other models that, sort of reduce the power of these cartels, not empower them even more. And unfortunately, I think, because it's an election season, these cartels are the people financing most of the main, people running for office. And, maybe people have better rhetoric or rhetoric you align with more, but rhetoric is rhetoric. We should pay attention to policy actions and the policy records of the people running. I think it's very important. And again, not trying to say like don't vote or anything, do whatever you want on election day. But the problem, as I see it, is that a lot of people on election day are like, as long as I vote, that's all I need to do. I can just go back to like living my normal life and not do anything else to stop where the country is going. I'm just going to vote for this one person and that's it. And I think that's the problem. If you want to spend election day voting for someone that you think is better, do whatever you want. I'm not trying to tell people what to do or who to vote for even. But what my problem is thinking that voting is all we need to do to solve the very dire problems that are facing the country right now.
Well,
there's
yeah, no, I think that's a great place to wrap up. Kind of like, what do you want people to know? Because amid this election, I feel like the most important, again, it's like what you do in your own community, with the people in your life, with your own finances, with your home. Like what should people do in order to move at least their inner circle in a positive direction and in the direction of freedom, really?
Yeah, well, I think a big part of it is being offline more and hanging out with people in real life and building, I don't know, alliances, networks, things that will help make your life and your community's life more resilient when the next economic crisis comes, things like that. And I think it's important for people to keep in mind exactly how manipulated social media is today, because I think a lot of people don't realize it. So in 2014, the US Air Force started investigating how to use social media to control people like drones. They spent like a couple $1 million on that research proposal, and other parts of the military and intelligence communities have researched social media for those same ends. And so yeah, 2014 was like 10 years ago, right? So a lot of this stuff has advanced, and it's not only the US government that's doing it. A lot of other national governments and intelligence agencies have invested a lot of money in developing sort of these mind weapons to be deployed on social media. So I think people should distrust a lot more what they see on social media, whether it's likes or retweets, because it's sort of similar to polling. I don't know if you remember back in 2016 where all the mainstream media outlets said Hillary Clinton's definitely going to win, like a 98% chance, and then she didn't win.
Yep.
I mean, the idea of that, you can manipulate polls just like you can manipulate social media posts and make people think certain opinions or certain people or certain policies are more popular than they really are. And they absolutely do that all the time.
For sure.
And considering that, you know, the US military specifically invested so much money in this, and Twitter right now is owned by a major military contractor, Elon Musk, to think that he wouldn't allow those weapons to be deployed on his platform, I think would be very naive. So I think people really need to keep that in mind. And I think there's a deliberate effort to make it hard for people to know what's real and what's not anymore as it relates to being online. And I think the best way to deal with all of these unprecedented, you know, things, I guess, that have been developed to try and manipulate us to unprecedented degrees is to be online maybe a little bit less. And a lot of us got pushed really online, especially during lockdowns in the COVID era. But maybe go outside and hang out with your like neighbors or something, or do stuff that people used to do. Learn to garden, maybe make a community garden. I don't know. But I mean, there's plenty of stuff people can do that doesn't involve, you know, watching the spectacle every day, especially in ways that are, you know, trying to manipulate us. And also, a few years ago, it came out that Facebook was manipulating people's news feeds to manipulate their emotions to make them more depressed. And we're conducting studies. And so they can tailor your news feed directly to you. They're like, this person is doing stuff we don't like. We're going to, you know, bombard them with stuff that's going to make them miserable and depressed. So they don't do stuff or don't do this, or they make this decision or they act this way. They absolutely do that. So I think people need to be very aware of how that happens, and to try and sort of, if you're aware coming into it, it's going to affect you less, but it can still affect you. I mean, we can all be manipulated by this stuff online. You know, I'm no exception. I don't think anyone else is really either, because they've studied human psychology so much and studied social media so much, and arguably helped make pretty much every social media platform that there is today, and get all the data from it also.
Oh, for sure.
And so I think, again, people need to be very careful about how they interact with it, and remember that, you know, the offline world, the analog world, is an important part of solving a lot of the problems that we have as a society.
I mean, it's so true. Oh my gosh, Whitney. And I'm so guilty of it. I feel like my emotions are sometimes a roller coaster. Bitcoin's price is volatile, but one day I feel like, yes, we're on this mission. We're going to save the world. We're going to fix broken money. And the next day I think, oh my gosh, they're going to tank the price of this somehow, and they're going to just shake everyone out. It's going to go down to 10K before they, I don't know. One day I'm really bullish, one day I'm really bearish. And you're right. We should just shut these devices down, go outside, be in the sunlight, touch grass, meet our neighbors, just interact in person. Today, I feel like people are terrified when the doorbell rings. The other day, I just moved apartments, and, you know, I had the doorbell ring, and I was like, who's coming here? Like, why are they here? And it was just a neighbor coming to say hello to me. But I'm like, why are you here? You know, and I feel like 2 decades
it's
ago,
very
it would have
different
been
than
like,
how it was.
oh, hello, you know, can I bring you some, you know, casserole and welcome you to the neighborhood? We've just come to like distrust each other, and there is so much to distrust. And it's like, I try to stay optimistic, but you're right. I mean,
well, the people we should distrust the most are the billionaires, because there has been a class war going on for a very long time. They have been stealing our money and pillaging our resources, whether you live in the US or in the global South. They have been screwing all of us. And so many of us trust them as the only possible. I mean, there's people today that say billionaires are the only thing, certain billionaires are the only thing standing between us and total tyranny. No. We can take responsibility and get off our knees and stop, you know, billionaire worshiping and stop tyranny if we wanted to. but acting like, the billionaire class, including people that have engaged and helped oversee wealth transfers, are going to be our saviors. I mean, this whole mentality is just crazy, honestly. But it's very ingrained in people. I guess we could, argue maybe it comes from Hollywood or it comes from any number of places, but there's sort of this tendency to wait for someone else to clean up the mess, and as long as we get this right guy or this guy can do it. But again, we need to take personal responsibility and get our stuff in order, clean up the mess in our area, because the government isn't going to do it. Because historically, what does the government do, whether it's Republican or Democrat in office? They take your stuff. They screw you over. They let crazy cartel companies that they're partnered with pollute your environment, and cause all these diseases or cancer or whatever, like Palestine, East Palestine, Ohio, and all of this stuff, and like nothing happens.
Right. No consequences. Never consequences.
Yeah. And, it just sort of gets papered over, and then social media and the news cycle, it moves so fast that, things get memory hold super quickly. But, if local communities come together and are resilient and are organized, then a lot of the stuff can improve. But, expecting 1 or 2 billionaires to magically, wave a wand and fix everything, I think is, quite frankly, delusional, even if it feels nice. But, there's a lot of people in quote unquote alternative media acting like, the answer to our free speech woes is just an Elon Musk, even though Twitter still censors. It's not like it stopped. Maybe they've gone against some censorship edicts from the EU and other places, but it's definitely not as free speech as perhaps some people think. But I think a lot of that's from very positive PR from a handful of people who claim that he's, the savior of free speech and all of that. And I think that's very different than what has actually happened. And I would argue that a lot of the reason, he bought Twitter again was to obtain user data to train AI, which if you haven't disabled it on your Twitter account, every tweet you make and everything you do on Twitter goes and feeds the Grok AI, and it trains off that. So, I mean, economic incentives are very important. A lot of times people say things that they're doing it for reasons X, Y, and Z. But if you actually follow the money, which is what a lot of people used to do, but don't really do as much anymore, other motives become quite apparent. Right. And, a lot of these billionaires, including in Silicon Valley, would not have become the billionaires they are if it wasn't for either government contracts or contracts with some of these big players in the, the cartel landscape of US corporate America. So a lot of these people, became billionaires because they played ball with some of the worst people in the world, and they continue to do so. So, again, I guess the common theme here is to not be naive, to be vigilant, and to perhaps distrust billionaires just a little bit more, and spend a lot more time, in your local community and with people who matter to you, and thinking about how we're going to opt out of these policies that everyone in politics is going to try and impose on us one way or another, and how we're going to, get through that as a community. Because all of these things, digital ID, programmable, surveillable money, it's not going to happen if people don't use them. Right? And so they have to frame it as voluntary. They have to create all these situations where we feel pressured to acquiesce, and we do acquiesce. And we need to be proactive about thinking how to not acquiesce, because if we don't acquiesce and enough people opt out, it fails.
Yeah. That's such a powerful and true message. Thank you so, so much. And I think that there's a beauty in just living a simpler life, to get off these platforms and, again, kind of focus on your family, focus on the people that you love, who aren't going to, judge you by how much is in your bank account, but, they're going to cherish you for your character. And I think we just need more of that in general, people that are willing to stand up and just be good people and care for their loved ones in a way that I think we've started to not care as much, because we're so focused on ourselves and on our digital lives. So such a great message, Whitney. It's always great to talk to you. Everyone, please go to unlimitedhangout.com, support Whitney's work. The investigations that she's done recently have been phenomenal, just as always. And I just really appreciate all the time that you take. It's it's so great that you expose all of these things, and then at the end of it, you still have this positive message of like, if we take control of our lives and our communities, we can make a difference, and we can prevent the tyranny that is pushing its way into our lives. So thank you, Whitney. It's been great to talk to you.
Thanks. Always great to be here.
Thank you so much for checking out this episode of Coin Stories. If you're listening on the Fountain app, you can show your support and share your thoughts by sending a boost. One of last month's top episodes was with Jeff Booth. At Hodl boosted 2021 sats and said, Booth once again provides perspective to help see through the matrix and a hopeful path forward. The man is onto something, and we need 1,000 more that can communicate like him. I agree. I love reading and replying to your boosts, so download Fountain on iOS or Android today and make sure you subscribe to Coin Stories. This show is for entertainment and educational purposes only. Nothing should constitute as official investment advice, and you should always do your own research. My inbox is open. If you want to share feedback or guest suggestions, just reach out at natalie@talkingbitcoin.com. Make sure you're subscribed to the show and check out my free newsletter, nataliebrunel.substack.com. I'll see you next time.